Good morning, everybody. Welcome to February. We're here for our February 1st PEN presentation by Dr. Jim Langley about connecting with your teens. So thank you for joining us this morning. You'll be glad to be here in the comfort of your own home instead of outside where it's cold. Or if you would like, you can watch this or send this to one of your family members or friends at another time. The podcast will be posted in the next 48 hours. So I wanted to welcome all of you and welcome our group of PEN board members who are here with us, supporting us. We have two super short announcements. I'll let Janice McNally start. Make sure you get your pen and paper out, or you have a file open for your computer so that you want to start writing some notes about what you're going to learn. But this is something you can put on your calendar for the near future. Janice?
Hi, Susu. Thanks. I'm Janice McNally, District Wellness Coordinator. And just a quick note to let you all know that if you join our April presentation, we'll have an overview at the top of the agenda from representatives from our District Health Services Office, together with our Stride Health community partners, to talk about our two school-based health centers that will be opening up in the district at Overland High School and Horizon Middle School. So that's a really exciting venture that we're embarking on and are already kind of well on the path for some. We've experienced some delays in opening given everything that's going on in the world, but wanted to give you an update nonetheless. So thanks, Susu, and look forward to that.
Thanks, Janice. So April 5th, that will happen along with our normal PEN presentation, which will be related to drugs and marijuana and vaping. Bobby Turner has another quick announcement.
Yeah, thanks, Susu. PEN is currently looking for volunteers. We have a number of different roles. And so if there is anything you enjoy doing in life, we probably have a way to work that into our volunteer activities. So a lot of our commitments, I will mention, are, maybe 2 or 3 hours a month. It's not a huge commitment. I've been a volunteer for PEN for about 8 years at this point. And the reason I've stayed so long is because PEN has been a really valuable experience for me as a parent. It's helped my family, just my attending all these presentations. I've learned so much. And PEN offers a way for all of our board members to connect with other parents and to make an impact in the lives of the people in our community. So I encourage you to reach out to us. Email penccsd@gmail.com if you have 2 or 3 hours a month and would like to be involved with a really fun group of volunteers. Thank you.
We are a fun group of volunteers.
Absolutely.
So we love our PEN board members, and we love all of you who attend, and we'd love to have you as part of our group that makes decisions and supports the bigger community. So please feel free to just reach out and inquire. You can get more information. So I wanted to thank all of you for having the desire to connect more with your teens. Being a parent is not for wimps, and being a parent of teens definitely tests your ability, your compassion, your patience, your understanding, your boundaries, all of those things. So today we are here with Dr. Jim Langley to get some more support in this journey. Maybe some of you remember when he was here a few years back teaching us about the adolescent brain. In fact, that might still be in our podcast library. So you can check that out after you listen today. So the way this will work is Jim will be presenting and talking with us. If you have a question that is just burning on your heart or your mind, please type it in the Q&A. And we will be happy to bring that up to Jim's attention at an appropriate time. So we'll try and get to all the questions that you have. If you already have something on your mind right now, feel free to write that in the Q&A and I'll bring it up. So without any further ado, get your pencils and paper ready, get your cup of tea or coffee, and get ready to learn and laugh and have a better way of dealing with your kiddo. All right, Jim, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Nice to be on. Wish we could be in person. So just to introduce myself real quick, thanks for the intro, Susu. I'm Dr. Jim Langley. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I was going to say what I specialize in, but then I realized I have ADHD and I like way too many things. So I do a lot of psychological testing. I do also a lot of retreats and workshops for family, marriage, life, that kind of thing. Really talking about a lot of the issues that I'm going to be bringing up today. But the most important thing is that I'm a husband and I'm a father of 5 boys. And I go through all the crazy same things you all go through. And, you know, let's face it, family life is incredibly, insanely hard. And we need 0 qualifications in order to be able to do it, right? There's no parenting license you have to get or anything like that. And yet it's harder than any day I have going to work. It's joyful, it's amazing, it's fun, it's incredible, but it's definitely harder than anything I have to put up with in my day job. You know, and it took me about 8 years to get my doctoral degree. Takes that long to go through med school. You know, you've got Navy SEALs who they never stop training, and yet as parents doing the hardest possible thing, we get 0 training. Basically, we're making it up as we go along, and it's crazy. You know, there's nights where I go to bed and I'm like, yeah, I did a good job at work today. I'm a pretty good therapist. There has never been a night where I go to bed and was like, you know, I am such an awesome parent. That's just not something that happens, right? And so I want to talk today with you guys about taking some of the pressure off of parenting. I want us all to connect with our kids. And one of the things that prevents that from happening is the pressure that's associated with parenting. You know, all of us want to be the best parents we can. We want to be perfect. One of the key principles I'm going to be addressing with you guys today is the idea of being a good enough parent. That's actually a technical term coined by an awesome psychologist, D.W. Winnicott, being a good enough parent. So you get more out of being an A parent than you do out of being an A+ parent, because to go from being like getting a 95 as a parent to getting a 99 as a parent takes so much effort and stress, and it's honestly not worth it. And I'm going to tell you why that is today. It also takes a good deal of intentionality in order to have really good relationships with your teens. They don't happen on their own. There's always so many forces pulling families apart at any given minute, right? There's bills to pay, there's homework to do, diapers to change, chores to make your kids do, activities to run around to. And so sometimes family life never quite feels urgent enough. You know, I sometimes will think to myself, gosh, I'd love to talk with my wife about how we can connect with the kids better. But gosh, first we need to talk about the budget, or we need to plan who's driving who to what activities. I'd love to figure out having family dinners, but there's just too many activities that get in the way. It's just not practical. The second law of thermodynamics says that basically the whole universe is moving from a state of order to a state of chaos because of entropy. And there is nowhere where this is more true than in family life, right? Without serious intentionality, your family will be pulled apart by all of the competing priorities we have in our life. Interestingly, the word priorities did not exist until the 1900s. Priority means most important thing, your one most important thing. And it wasn't until, I guess, our crazy American culture decided, well, there can be more than one most important thing. Actually, that's not true. Most of us would say that the most important thing in our life is our family. Family is the most important thing. But unfortunately, because of how crazy life is, and especially in our culture, it's very difficult to live that priority out. So think for a second. If you agree with my statement, family life is the most important thing, what percentage of time during your week is given over to that? And if answering that question for yourself can sort of answer for yourself, like, am I living out my values? And if you prioritize that and you can make more of that, I guarantee you'll get more out of your family life. Now, think for a second, who is happier? A person who has a rich and rewarding family life, but a mediocre so-so career, or a person who has this awesome career, but a mediocre family life? There's a lot of rich guys out there who will commit suicide because they realize that achievement is not the most important thing, that it didn't get them where they want to go. But I doubt there's a lot of guys out there offing themselves who are living in happy, healthy families, but they just didn't get that big promotion they wanted. And so redirecting our own priorities, our own value system as parents is contagious to our children. And it starts with us. That is a very pressure-filled statement in some respects, but it's also very empowering. As I'm going to talk about as we go along here, a lot of research about positive parenting practices has a little bit less to do with what you do with your actual child as much as it has to do with what you do with yourself. It's actually really empowering when you can embrace that. As those of you who have teens know, as we get older, we have less and less and less control over our teenagers, over our children. And it's a very disconcerting experience, right? My colleague, Craig Nippenberg, will talk about how parenting, it is not an engineering project, right? Like, you can't make your child into anything. It's more like gardening. You tend to your plants, you tend to your children, but you do not make your children, which is hard, I think, for some of us to accept. Now, I think that the pandemic is a wonderful opportunity. As long as it is, it feels like, March 674th, 2020 right now. But it has its positive sides to it, right? It gives us an opportunity to really reflect on what's important. And if we agree that family life should be the most important thing in our life, it gives us a chance to really focus on that. And I can't emphasize with you enough how critical that is right now. Last May, Children's Hospital announced that child and adolescent mental health was in a state of crisis. And I completely believe it. As a clinician, all the therapists I work with are bursting at the seams with maybe a little too much job security these days. And, a lot of it is related to, this crazy virtual learning versus walking around with masks all day. And what's the next policy going to be? And parents walking around with immense levels of stress. Hopefully there's something temporary to that. But I think it is revealing something a little bit more important, which is the state of chaos that we allow ourselves to live in. If we live our days, at an 8 or 9 out of 10 on a level of stress, on a scale of stress, we can be pushed over the edge way too easily. And managing family stress, I can't stress to you enough how important that is. There was a study done at Harvard that talked about what makes successful students. And what's interesting is they found that the students who took time to hang out with their friends and invest in relationships were way more successful than the kids who just focused on studying. Those were the kids who actually ultimately ended up dropping out. But what happens is when we're under stress, what we tend to do is we divest ourselves of our relationships. So rather than invest and turn towards what's most important, we tend to turn away. And obviously that's a real problem when you're parenting a teenager, because what percentage of the time is not stressful raising a teenager? It seems like it's stressful all the time. And so we will be talking about managing your own stress. But first, I do want to give you guys a little bit of information about understanding your teen's brain. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I am parenting my 2 teenagers, I feel like they're just crazy. Like they're crazy or they're toddlers or whatever. And it actually turns out that the teenage brain has more in common in some respects with a toddler than with either a child or an adult brain. And there's a reason for this. During adolescence, there's more change, more growth happening in the brain than any other period of time in a kid's life other than toddlerhood. So when your child is acting sort of crazy and toddlerish, it's because it's true. They really are that way. And so what's going on is there's huge, massive changes going on in their neural network inside their brain. So what's happening is it's called neural pruning. And so the child brain it's like a sponge. It's made up of trillions and trillions of connections. They say that there's more connections within the human brain than there are stars in the universe. And in adolescence, these trillions of connections start getting pruned back. It sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually what allows our brains to become specialized in, whatever it is we find ourselves doing, whether it's doing psychology or parenting, driving a taxi cab, whatever it is our job. Our brain becomes more and more specialized as we get older. But what's hard is a consequence of that is that this period of neural pruning makes the teen brain a little bit out of balance, as you've probably noticed with your kids. Where different areas in the brain are developing at different rates and different stages of adolescence. So for instance, early on in adolescence, deep within our brain, the limbic system is kicking into full gear. This is the part of our brain that's associated with emotional intensity, drive for reward, motivation. And it uses this neurochemical called dopamine, which I'm assuming most of you know a little bit about. Dopamine is awesome. It's associated with seeking rewards, motivation, focus, all this kind of thing. It's great. It's one of those chemicals that really allow ourselves to have an awesome life. But there is such thing as too much dopamine. So for example, our dopamine levels shoot through the roof when kids are smoking pot or are really, really honed in on playing their video games. There is such thing as having too much of it. And what's interesting about teenagers is when they have a dopamine high, they have way more dopamine than adults, but their actual baseline level of dopamine tends to be lower than adults, which helps explain why teens are just kind of bored all the time. I was in Kauai last April with my family on this epic family vacation, right? So exciting. And there we are, like looking off at this just incredible killer view. And my 13-year-old was like, it's all right. And you just want to punch him in the face, right? Like, it's just like, what? Do you know how much money I spent to get you here? Well, it's because it's just their brain. It's just their brain has on an ongoing basis lower levels of dopamine, which is why their brains seek out reward more intensely than a lot of as adults. Teens want to do something novel, exciting, risky. It leads to teen impulsivity. It's not because they're dumb, it's because they're growing into their brains. Now, there's still a problem or two here. The dopamine system is on fire during early adolescence, but the emotional brakes and the filter of the brain located here in our prefrontal cortex hasn't exactly come online yet. And so this is what leads to the emotional impulsivity, the overreactions that you see. And what's interesting is the limbic system, that deep inside of our brain system, is located between our our prefrontal cortex in the back of our brain, our animal center, our survival center. And actually it's a really good sort of description of what emotions are, because they're not fully rational things. You know, when your teen or your child has this emotional freak out, what's the worst thing you can ask them after it happens? Why did you do that? What's their answer? I don't know. They're not hiding anything. They really don't know. I love telling my favorite story in my own life that exhibits this perfectly is when I was about 14, I got into an argument with my parents about taking up the trash. My mom called me upstairs and she literally said, "Hey, Jimmy, take out the trash." And it triggered this massive emotional meltdown. I was like, this is unbelievable. You just won't let me be me. I've got to focus on myself. And I went on for hours screaming the worst possible things I could at my parents. And then when I finally sort of calmed down, my parents made the mistake of thinking I was done, which I was not. And so my dad asked me to write a letter of apology to my mom, which was a very reasonable request. But I used it as an excuse to like put my rant into writing. And I was talking about how like lines such as, you know, infants in orphanages die every single day because of the love that they don't receive. My plight is much worse. And it just went on and on and on. And the next day, I had no idea why it happened. I had no idea. There was no reason why I had that meltdown. It was because of my brain. And it's really sort of crazy making. There's also actually a reason for it. And this is an important parenting note to think about here. A teenager and children, and sometimes even us as adults, we don't always know how to put our feelings into words. Emotions are actually really complicated things. You know, you have to connect literally a feeling going on inside your body. That's why we call them feelings, with a thought that's taking place in our head that's related to some circumstance going on in our lives. There's a lot going on there. And it doesn't necessarily come natural for a teenager to talk about it in words, especially when that limbic system is on fire. And so instead, what a kid does is they act them out. And so sometimes parents will say, in therapy with me, like, gosh, I just don't understand my kid. I don't know how to reach them. I don't know what's going on in their lives. And the very best place to start, the first place to start, is to take an inventory of how your teenager makes you feel. So what happens is they vomit their emotional state out on to you guys. Sometimes it's probably really nice. You know, teens are fun. And sometimes it's probably really, really frustrating. Well, think back when your teenager was an infant. It's so fun watching parents of infants, right? The baby will literally puke all over your shoulder. And what does a parent do? Like, they don't really even take notice, and they'll grab like the nearest napkin or whatever and just sort of like wipe it off and move on. No big deal. Actually, that's a very similar reaction that we need to strive to have with our teenagers. They're actually asking for something very similar. They just need us to contain and understand their emotions. And so if you reflect for yourself when they're being frustrating, when they're having a hard time, how am I feeling as a parent? And a lot of times you'll come up with things like, well, I feel angry. That's the first thing parents will usually say. Like, what's underneath that? Well, what's underneath that a lot of times is I feel helpless. I feel scared. I feel really anxious. And if you can respond to your teen not in that state of anger or frustration or belittling you as parents, that's a common one, and actually reach the emotion that's underneath there, that is an amazing way to connect with your kid. It's sort of like parenting jujitsu. Now, sometimes it involves really, really good acting skills. I mean, I'm an emotionally reactive person myself, and my kids will sometimes say something to me and I just want to go crazy on them. And so it's taken a lot of training of myself to be able to respond not to what they're giving me, but what's going on underneath the surface. So there's, this sounds like a kind of a cheesy therapist-y thing to say, but there's some neurological truth to this. Our brains, our emotions can be narrowed down to just two, love and fear. And so when our kid is experiencing a sort of a negative emotion, a lot of times it comes out as anger. Well, deep down inside, really what's happening is that your child is in a state of fear. Imagine what would happen if in moments of conflict, you responded to the fear state rather than to the anger state. It completely changes how we react, how we connect with our kids, and it grounds them a whole lot. The other thing that's important to keep in mind along those lines is they're vomiting their emotions onto us for a reason. They have no idea what's going on inside of their brains, right? They have more in common with toddlers than they would care to admit. And so as frustrating as it is, they're actually their behavior pulls us in as parents. It's sort of an invitation as parents to respond to them in a way that nurtures healthy dependence in a way. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, despite all this, right, there's opportunities here. You might think to yourself, like, why would God or natural selection design our brains this way? It's incredibly frustrating. And there's literally, very serious consequences when you have teens, drinking and driving and getting themselves into serious trouble. Well, there actually is a reason for it. And it all comes down to the whole purpose of adolescence, which is to discover your sense of identity. And so all the time, I'm a therapist and I spend tons of time talking to my children. And you know how many I get at least once a week, the line from my kids like, "Dad, you just don't understand. You don't understand me." Well, yes, there is some truth to that. I probably don't understand them. But really what our kids are saying in those moments is, I don't understand myself. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who I am. And so adolescence, when done well, when healthy, a kid goes from having no idea who they are, having most of their, values and beliefs or whatever being sort of downloaded from mom and dad, to really owning their own identities and their own values by the time they've developed. And so that's a really good thing. It's also a really hard thing. It's so disconcerting. Your teen might be trying on different identities on a daily basis. I remember when I was developing, I started off in high school being, kind of a lonely little bookworm who would just spend my, lunch reading books in the library or outside or whatever. And I got tired of that. So I thought, I am gonna be a stoner. That's what I'm gonna be. And so I started wearing, all the shirts that stoners wear and like acting like that. The problem with that is I had no desire to do drugs. So it didn't really work out for me to be in that circle, because maybe passing around the weed or whatever, and I just couldn't bring myself to have any. And so that didn't work out well. So then I thought to myself, you know what I'm gonna be? I'm gonna be a popular kid. I'll be a popular jock. That's what I'm gonna do. Except I was not popular. And so that whole part of the equation did not really work out for me. And so I eventually settled on being a bookworm who had a group of friends who were also sort of nerdy little bookworms. And that worked great for me. It was really healthy for me, but it took so much work, so much effort to get there. And it is disconcerting. And there does need to be a level of letting go. Parenting is such a difficult dance, because, when our babies are babies, we are literally responsible for them not dying, right? If we don't do something, they will just die. They will kill themselves, right? Well, as kids get older, knowing when to let go of control and when to exert control is so messy. I think it's just inevitably a messy thing. So with teenagers, it's actually it's even harder, because a lot of times late, kind of middle schoolish kids will seem to be in this like beautiful sweet spot. They're doing their homework. They're kind of delightful. You don't need to exert a ton of control over them. And then
I just wanted to ask if my painting was ready just by chance. It was supposed to be the 3rd, but I wasn't sure. Oh, Winfelt.
Hey,
It's the
if you-
flower. I was just curious because I'm
Solange?
shopping.
Hang on, Solange, you're on.
Yeah, if you guys in the audience could just make sure you're muted unless you have a question you want to
Yeah.
ask.
Shari, maybe you can mute or remove. That would be great.
Done.
Alrighty.
Got it.
So back to business here. So I was talking about how parenting is this really difficult dance of moving a kid from a state of utter dependence to a state of healthy interdependence. It's actually not independence that we're shooting for. That's not the end goal, right? We want our kids to be in healthy relationships and in community. And to some degree, our kids will always need us and we will need our kids. But in order to get there, our kid goes from a state of dependence to a state of independence, sometimes a very strong state of independence. And then from there is able to enter back into like a healthy, more balanced relationship with us. And it takes a lot of experimentation. It takes a lot of failure. And it's very difficult as parents to let go, especially as parents that, it's easy for us to sort of vicariously live through our kids. As parents, we put so much of our self-esteem points into the success and happiness of our own children. But there's pros and cons to this. Of course, we should be focused on making our kids happy. But there's definitely problems when our own definitions of happiness and success are imposed upon our children. And when they fail to live up to that, kids feel that, right? If it takes 5 years or whatever to get a PhD, then your 15-year-old has 3 PhDs in you. They know you inside and out. They can read exactly what you think about them, what you feel about them. And that's a delicate thing. Kids act like they don't care, but actually they're in a state that's much more insecure than previous stages of their development. They don't know who they are, and they're just coming to realize that. They're experimenting with that. It's so delicate. And so being very conscious of how you perceive your child is really predictive of their success. There's research done in the ADHD world that shows that kids with ADHD whose parents have a positive perspective on them and on their development end up being far more successful than children who don't. In some respects, that sounds like obvious, but it's such a powerful predictor that we can't ignore it. We have to pay attention to the fact that our children's ideas of what we think of them are incredibly powerful. And it does feel like it puts a little pressure on us for sure. Now, along the lines of moving from dependence to independence, how do we accomplish this and still do our job as parents, right? I was having a discussion with my kid the other night about how him making his own choices and being independent doesn't mean that I just magically stop caring. That's not how that works, right? So what does help, what makes a huge difference is instead of saying, hey, Michael, stop doing that, quit bothering your brother, whatever, instead actually ask questions of your kid, and they might not answer you in the moment, and that is perfectly okay. So, a little kid, if they're just used to mom and dad guiding their behavior, like, oh, it sounds like we have a question here. Let me finish my point here, and then I'm happy to take it. So a little kid is, we have to make sure they stay alive, right? So it's like very directed, do this, do that, stop doing this, stop doing that. And as kids get older, we have less and less control over that, but we do have power to teach our children more self-awareness. And we can't do that if we are super stressed out as parents ourselves. We have to be able to stay calm and ask questions for them to reflect on. And like I said, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be like, oh, sure, mom and dad. No, they're going to have to think about it. And it plants a seed that hopefully can grow into self-awareness. So with that, what's the question?
All right, we've got 2 questions.
Ooh, okay, I like it. It's a good time.
What do you do when your child's self-exploration leads them down a path of disliking themselves and self-loathing?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That is maybe the very biggest question. So like I was saying, there is an element of, as our kids get older, we have less and less control over our children. It doesn't mean we don't have no control over our children. And so there is an element of we have to do what we need to do to keep our kids sort of on the rails, is how I tell my children. And the first thing that parents will threaten to do is to, like, take away social media, take away, devices. I have that similar temptation all the time. And there are times where I think it's completely justified. And there's times where it's probably less justified. But I don't think, as parents, when we see our children suffering, our first reaction is a reaction to want to control. And that is something that we need to fight. We need to start with listening. Unless your child is literally suicidal, which obviously can be the case this day and age, then reacting with control is going to backfire. So in relationship research, there is the idea of pursuers and avoiders, and almost every human relationship gets into this dynamic. In parenting, it is usually the parent who's the pursuer and the teenager who's the avoider. And so the more that you push, the more that you try to control, the more that your teen is likely to just pull away from you, to not listen to you. And so you need to focus, I think, as a parent, I'm not saying this is easy, on doing everything you can to reflect your child's identity and self-worth. So a sort of controversial, especially this day and age, belief I have as a parent and a professional is that, to some degree, even though our children need to go out and explore their identities and figure out who they are, there's also an element of a child's identity that does need to be bestowed by the parent, because the children are seeking and seeking and seeking. Well, if they're seeking only among their peers, it's literally the blind leading the blind. The children, the other kids that they are associating with and connecting with, they're just as lost as the teenager, as your kid. And so we can't expect that they're going to find their a super healthy sense of identity through their kids. Interesting research has been done that's found that, obviously having good, healthy parents involved with your child's life is really important and can lead to good outcomes. But actually having 4 involved adults in your kid's life, whether it's family or not, is really one of the best predictors of a kid's success. And it comes back to this kind of blind leading the blind thing. And so if you're in the state or trying to prevent the state of your child going down the path of self-loathing, really getting them connected with a larger community above and beyond you actually gives you a lot of freedom to enter into a good, deep, healthy relationship with your kid. You're sort of like offloading some of the parenting responsibility onto other adults who have your teen's best interest in mind. That frees things up. An easy example is homework battles. Sometimes it's just worth spending the money to pay a tutor literally to help manage the homework, so you don't have to argue about that all the time. And really focusing a lot on quality time. One thing I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, so I'm going to put a pin in quality time, is quality time versus quantity time. They're both really incredibly important, but it takes it takes a lot of investment. It also to get your teen out of that state. Depending on how severe it is, sometimes it does involve moving your child's school or taking drastic measures, hopefully you can intervene before that becomes necessary. Obviously, kids typically don't really want to move schools. That's a really stressful thing for kids and parents. And then, this day and age, what's awesome is that mental health care is becoming less and less stigmatized. I mean, at some point in our lives, everybody sees a therapist. My kids see a therapist. I am a therapist. There's a lot of therapy all everywhere. And so getting your kid connected in counseling is a reflection of you being a good parent, not a reflection of you being a poor parent. And doing it sooner rather than later is worth it. Kids, I've never once had a kid be excited to come see me in therapy. It's just not something that happens. Oh, great, Dr. Langley, I'm so happy to be here. No, that's not going to happen. And so as parents, we know that sometimes doing our due diligence towards our kids involves doing things that they don't want to do. And so, yeah, the idea of keeping your kid on the rails is important, and it's hard, especially with some of the decisions that they make. So think about this. I literally will not let my kids choose what they have for dinner most nights, right? They're going to make just the other night, my kids were trying to make literally for dinner homemade donuts, which they had no idea how to make. Yeah, they thought this was a good health decision. So if we can't trust our kids to do something basic like that, then we can't trust them to make some of the huge decisions that they are facing completely on their own. We have to be involved, and sometimes we have to put limits and boundaries on, and that doesn't feel very good. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of investment. So I don't think that fully answers the question, but I think I will get to some more of that as we go along here in this next section that I'm going to be talking about. So Susu, what's the other question?
So when you talk about that next part, if you can also make sure you address if the child also were to start acting out and not following rules at home and school, versus the more lethargic, despondent, self-loathing, both of the extremes. But the other question said that you were just about to say something about the middle schooler who is doing well with homework and then transitions into high school and there's changes.
Okay.
Do you recall that?
Yeah, real quick. So the age, the brain state of a kid who's aged 10 to 12 is it doesn't mean that your kid is easy. I don't think kids are basically ever easy, but it's a beautiful stage in a lot of respects, right? They're just a little bit more pliable. They just have less angst and anxiety sometimes. School hasn't reached this fever pitch of intensity a lot of times. It's just like a golden age of parenting, a lot of parents will say. Again, doesn't mean it's easy, just means it's easier, I think, than some of the other phases that we face. But then comes high school, and the brain starts literally lights on fire and is really, really difficult. A teen, when they are going into high school, as early as their freshman year, they're faced with just immense hard challenges, right? I've got to fit in, but I got to be an individual just like everybody else. They need to start giving thought to what are they going to do for the rest of their lives? They've got the constant peer pressure to do drugs or not to do drugs. Huge, huge decisions. There's so much pressure, and it comes on very quickly. A lot of times, I just recently worked with a kid who, he went from being in a smaller middle school class in this little private school, and he was getting straight A's, and now he's in a big but very good high school, and he's completely failing everything. And it's because, he sort of drove off this cliff in a sense of he felt like he knew who he was in middle school, and he's in 8th grade, and all of the teachers are they know him and all of that. And all of a sudden he's in this huge environment and he doesn't know himself. He doesn't know half the kids. It's an immediate and overwhelming experience. And, as adults, we probably have gone through multiple big transitions, and we know what to expect from a big transition. Teenagers typically have not gone through very many gigantic transitions. And so it's new for them. So they don't necessarily have the same resilience that we have as adults. If it happens, I mean, it's basically normal when that occurs. But yeah, that's I think what I was getting at there, that it can feel sometimes like you've got everything in hand as a parent and everything's going just fine. And then all of a sudden, boom, your kid's really struggling as soon as the freshman year of high school. And it's not necessarily a reflection at all on your parenting. So, okay, now what I want to do is talk a little bit about our family lives and how we can build more attachment and connection into them. And hopefully that will lead to some answers as far as what do we do when our children are really, really struggling and really, really suffering. So this might sound controversial in our egalitarian culture, but family life is indeed a hierarchy. It's at its best when it functions as a hierarchy. Mom and dad are at the top of the hierarchy, and the children are lower down on the hierarchy. Sounds mean, but it's actually not, and I'll tell you why. And parents sometimes experience that it's like blasphemy, right? Like, my kids are the most important thing in my life. I die for them. I do anything for them. Yeah, of course you would. Yeah. But it's not, but putting your children first, it's not only best for moms and dads, it's actually best for kids too. And I'll tell you why. The number one thing kids need is a secure and loving environment. It's emotional safety is what they're seeking. And if a child grows up in just this, a safe and secure, loving environment, and has nothing else, the kid's probably going to be fine, actually. And intuitively, I think we know this as parents, that safety and security and a loving environment is really, really important. But think about this: if you prioritize your relationship with your significant other, then you will be working better together as yourself. You'll have more deposits in your own love bank, and you'll be working better together as a parenting unit. So as silly as it sounds, the love and affection that you and your spouse can have increases and gives you more love to give away. So if you're connected with your spouse, it's going to multiply everybody's love bank, and then it's going to end up spilling over into your children. My wife and I are best friends, and we love each other a lot. We literally date 3 days a week, at least. And if 2 days go by where we haven't literally gone outside and sipped on whiskey with a fire and talked, and we feel disconnected. And our kids tease us mercilessly about this. But it is so incredibly powerful, because even though we're spending all these hours outside away from our children, it has such an amazing effect on our kids, because our kids know that we are a family that has a lot of love. Doesn't go perfectly all the time, doesn't mean we have things under control all the time, but I don't think any of them can have a doubt that there's a lot of love in our family. But it doesn't work very well when we reverse the hierarchy. So if your priority is on your children, you end up having less to give to your spouse. It's harder to stay connected, and then everyone burns out. So when we flip that hierarchy upside down, things tend to backfire. And if that goes on too long, families become, really disconnected, and there's just, so much pressure, and it's so difficult. So, and I talk about this with families all the time. They say, it's just, how do we do this? This is really hard. We're driving to activities daily. The kids. How do we not prioritize? How do we even get away from that? But I want you to think about this. If you are one of those families, and we are sometimes for sure, when you are going crazy, doing all the millions of activities for your kids, how connected does your family feel when you live that way? How happy are you, actually? I learned this lesson really in a very hard way a few years ago. A saying my wife and I have for our family is Langley's do hard things. We're not going to shy away from doing hard things. Well, sometimes that saying totally backfires. So if we have a choice between doing something the easy way or doing something the hard way, I always choose the hard way. I'm stupid. So instead of being well, we can't make it to that, or no, the kid can't be in this activity for this semester, we will say like, we'll do it all. We'll do it all. And next thing you know, we'll run ragged, we're exhausted, and we don't have very much to give, and we have much disconnection in our family. That insane focus on busyness really tends to backfire. I was in a classroom a couple of years ago that just made me really angry. The teacher had a picture on the wall that said, "Friends, sleep, good grades, pick two." I actually think that is an awful message to teach your kids. I'm all about hardcore things, but actually that is not a recipe for happiness. And the way that we live our lives as a family, as our own family culture, teaches our children what a good recipe for happiness is. And if our own recipe for happiness isn't working out, we need to take a look at that, because that's exactly what we're passing on to our kids. But one thing I wonder about a lot, why did parenting become so hard, become such a mystery, right? Look, we've been parenting for thousands and thousands of years, and our cave ancestors did not have all the parenting books and all the tools and Love and Logic and all this stuff. Why did it become so hard? Well, there's actually an idea out there on why this is. So apparently there have been more books written on parenting starting in 1970 on up to the present than there were completely, around the world all time prior to that. And, I believe it. And the idea here is that, well, around the 1950s, all of a sudden these different conveniences started entering into family life, right? There's the dishwasher and just different things that took the edge off of parenting and family life. And all of a sudden, more parental guilt started creeping in. So my grandma, she has, for better or worse, I guarantee she has 0 ounces of parental guilt, none. She knows she was a great parent. And she has good reason to think that. She spent like 12 hours a day cleaning and cooking and scrubbing, and that was the life. And then, my parents' generation comes around, and it's different, right? All of a sudden, there's this pressure to be the best parent, and we think in terms of competition. We're very competitive as parents. Like, my kids are better than your kids. My parenting's better than your parenting, and it really affects our own self-worth as parents. And that self-worth, like I said before, is contagious to our children. And so parenting doesn't have to be hard. Like I said, we can be a good enough parent, and that's better than being a perfect parent. So I want to pass on some encouraging research. This is actually, thanks, Susu. This is perfect. Ask what's the question, and then we can talk about that next piece.
Just in looking, when you were talking about connecting with your spouse, for those people who are single parents for whatever reason, just how would you keep that perspective in line as a solo parent?
Yeah.
Of not letting your kid's life just whirl out of control and take over your life.
I was going to get to that. That's perfect. So yeah, there are plenty of us out there, for whatever reason, that are parenting. We're single parents, and that is an okay thing, right? It's also does have its own challenges. I mean, it just does. I would say that self-care as a single parent is even more important. I mean, you're everything to your kids, and that is incredible. It's amazing, super impressive. It's also totally overwhelming. And so caring for yourself, making sure that you, as the life giver to your children, have life to give, is really important. That means taking care of your emotional health, your mental health. Really being focused on that so that you have more to give. And then it's like I was saying before, our kids need 4 adults. There's such thing as it does take a village. And this idea of an attachment village, especially for single parents, is incredibly, incredibly important. So an attachment village is a network of loving adults in your kids' lives who can contribute to your kids' healthy sense of self-worth, self-esteem, knowing that they're loved, being taken care of. It's really, really important to have some of that, to have other people who can step in. And if you don't have that, that's okay. I would make it a priority to seek it out, find other, make friends with other families who have some bandwidth to give. I mean, it's so hard for us as parents to ask for help, especially asking for help about very simple things, but we have to try. We have to ask for help and support, because parenting, like you said, it's not for wimps. It'll eat you alive. And so doing it, if you're a single parent, it doesn't mean you have to do it alone exactly. You can do it in a little attachment village. It takes a lot of work and a lot of intentionality, but that is way better than just trying to do it on your own. You just have to have a lot of compassion and self-acceptance and all that, and then courage to ask for support and make sure people know that. That's what I would say about that. So
Thank you.
a number of years ago, this really cool psychologist named Roger Epstein did research on what are the most important, effective parenting practices out there. What do they do? And it wasn't driven by a given philosophy like love and logic or something like that. It's just like what leads to success. What are the behaviors that parents do that make kids turn out well? And it's a list of pretty straightforward things. It's actually kind of encouraging. I'll read it to you. So first we have love and affection. That one seems pretty obvious. We're going to spend some more time here in a couple minutes talking about it. We have relationship skills. We have safety, stress management, autonomy and independence, education and learning, behavior management, and then actually, believe it or not, religion was on there. And so what the speculation there is, it's kind of back to the idea of the attachment village, that being involved in a religious community helps give you a sense of connection with other people and other people whose values are in line with your own. Gives kids and increases the sense of safety and security that they have. So I want to start with love and affection, and this is where it gets sort of interesting. So many of these behaviors are not as specifically related to you giving love and affection to your kids or teaching them relationship skills or teaching them stress management. It's actually, the research finds, is more about you doing that for yourself. And by you doing that for yourself, it's actually contagious to your children. So I want to talk about attachment. Attachment is so fundamental to everything in life. If we grow up in a healthy attachment, the rest of our life could be really hard and we can still be happy. And if we grow up with an unhealthy attachment, we can reach happiness, but it's going to take a lot more work in order to become happy. So our attachment is basically the bond that we form with other people. And in childhood, it's the bond that we form with our parents. And different things make up this bond. What is the level of emotional attunement? That one is huge. Do our parents understand our emotional states? Do our parents give us the dependence of nurturance, but also the independence of allowing us to be our own person? That sort of thing. Hugely predictive of happiness and success in life. And of course, we all want to give these things to our children. So here's what's interesting, and this is kind of good news and it's bad news. The best predictor of attachment that our children have is our own attachment experiences as in our growing up. So if we want to predict our kids' attachment style, we look at how what we grew up with. It's kind of amazing. So I'll give you some reasoning behind this. So you can teach a rat to fear the smell of roses if you shock the rat every time they smell roses. Well, here's what's interesting. If that rat's children will be afraid of the smell of roses as well, even if they've never been shocked at the smell of a rose, it's called a phenotypic gene mutation. And what's kind of crazy is that mutation gets passed right on down to grandchildren. Grandbaby rats are also sort of afraid of the smell of roses. And so our children sort of download some of our own experiences, and it has absolutely nothing to do with anything we did or did not do. It is it's pretty frustrating. It can be pretty stressful, but it also can be really empowering, because if you have self-reflection and you can grow yourself, that growth gets passed on to your kids as well. And so taking some time to reflect on, sometimes I lead retreats on this exact issue, and I'll tell you some of the questions I have people ask themselves. What were all some of the positive and negative experiences I had as a child? What did family life make me feel? What was my kind of normal emotional state? How much safety did I have? And then, were my parents attuned to me? So meaning, like, did they spend time with me? Did they understand me? Did they talk to me? And also, did they nurture my independence in a healthy way as well? And so just gaining insight for yourselves as parents into that question insight is freedom. Insight is so freeing. And so you can, instead of subconsciously passing on some of these behaviors to your kids, and literally every single one of us does it, we can be just more mindful about it. So I'm seeing a question on there that's super relevant about how does the rat example work with adopted children? A couple of different ways. One is, this is why adoption is an amazing thing and can be a really hard thing, because the child you're adopting, you don't know what that kid's grandparents' experiences in life typically were, right? And so you're inheriting a whole set of issues that you don't necessarily know what that's going to be, what you're going to get. So, that's why I think there's value in understanding and learning as much as you can about an adoptive family. And even if it's a really healthy adoptive situation, there's still going to be baggage that comes along with it, because literally every single one of us has baggage. There's nobody that doesn't have baggage. And so the challenge is you have two sets of baggage you have to reflect on now, right? You have to reflect on the phenotypic gene baggage that your adopted child comes with. And you also still have to reflect on your own attachment baggage. So in some respects, it's more complicated, but it's the same. It's sort of the same process in a way. Still having to be self-reflective, and then really giving some good reflection to your children. Now, I really want to help families increase attachment. I think it's just so fundamental to happiness, joy, and success in our lives. But it becomes really tricky, right, as parents. The first easy behavior to keep in mind, it's not an easy behavior, but it's easy to keep it in mind, is the ratio of positive to negative interactions. So in general, relationships are at their best when it's something like a 5-to-1 positive to negative interaction ratio. And in parenting, that really is sometimes hard to achieve because kids can be really frustrating and parents can be very, very stressed out. Well, one thing that we can do a little bit better of a job of as parents is giving some thought to what do our kids classify as a negative interaction? What is hard for them? And so for us as parents, this happens all the time for me. I'll be driving one of my kids to school and just try and make conversation. And just the question, hey, what's going on at school today, counts as a negative interaction for them because they don't want to talk about school. It's like if I have a hard day at work and my wife asked me about it, that can it sometimes feel like a negative thing, right? So being really aware of what our children experience as negative interactions. And it's sort of depressing as parents sometimes because we realize, oh my gosh, there's not as much positivity going on here, right? Like I spent Saturday, my wife was out seeing a friend and I spent the day running the family chores, and it was mainly negative interactions, right? Like, hey, go clean your room. Hey, go do the laundry. Stop messing around with this. Stop doing that. Those negative interactions pile up really, really quickly. When I do marriage retreats, a principle I'll talk about is the idea of nobody likes to hug a cactus. And as parents, I think we are unwittingly cactuses all the time. And so if we want our children to have relationships with us, we have to have the positivity, the flexibility, the interest level to be something that the kids want to connect with. A lot of times, especially when parenting is hard, it doesn't feel that way for the kid. You know, the last thing a kid wants to do is talk to mom and dad. It's not necessarily because mom and dad are bad, but it feels, you know, the ratio between positive and negative is flipped. And so it takes just a lot of effort, just like all things in relationships, to make sure that that ratio is in place. And so there's going to be times where you got to shoot for a 2-to-1 ratio is maybe the best you can muster for a day. Even doing that is really, really, really important. The other thing is along similar lines to keep in mind is, you know, parents will often say to me, we try to spend more quality time as family, but our teenager just says they don't want to do it. They just want to go look at their phone and stare into space or whatever. Yes, that is true. I experience that all the time with my kids. But here's the thing. Our kids would rather have parents who force them to have quality time than to have parents who are absent and don't do that. That is a worse fate for a child. And the child actually does know that at some level. I think also kids, their sense of self-worth and their identity is still like very fresh. It's very insecure. And I think there's value in giving our children in a healthy way an idea that we're pursuing them because we love them. Like they're worth going after, they're worth finding and meeting, you know, putting up with their frustration, you know, and still loving them through that. I mean, think about what the impact that has on teaching your child that they are unconditionally lovable. That even if he's being a total jerk, staring at the sunset in Kauai, and you've spent all these thousands of dollars on them, that you still love them through that. It's amazing, and it takes time and investment in order for it to get there. But I can't tell you how amazing and positive that can be. A little bit ago, I referenced the idea of quality time versus quantity time. You know, we get the idea of quality time, I think, is everybody knows about it. Nobody questions that quality time is really, really important. I will tell you, as a father of 5 boys, quality time is really hard. One-on-one time with that many kids sometimes feels basically impossible. But actually, what is just as important as quality time is something we never talk about anymore, and that's quantity time. And what that does, you know, different therapists or writers will call it like couch time. The family is just being around each other, being in each other's company, being in each other's presence, having little micro interactions, you know, reaching into the fridge at the same time. It actually gives kids that sense of safety that I was talking about. It's hugely important. And because of the chaos of our culture, I think it's easy to get away from that, right? Who's not busy? You ask somebody, you know, how are you doing? Oh, I'm busy but good, is a very common response. Now, busyness is a counteractive force in attachment, right? Think about someone that you are close with. For me, it's my spouse. There is a direct correlation between my busyness or my wife's busyness and our sense of connection. And the busier we are, the more the connection goes down. And if that's true for our spouse, it's also true for our children. So having a sense of balance and doing less, even when we're surrounded by families who are going to the millions of activities and doing all the things. I think it actually takes a little bit of courage to do less than other families because there's just so much pressure out there. And as adults, we don't always have our own self-esteem issues worked out, believe it or not. But it's also so freeing. That doesn't mean you don't do anything. Obviously, there's lots to do. But yeah, I would encourage radically cutting out busyness in your life in order to increase your family connection. All right, one of the last things I want to talk about here is the idea of having traditions and fun in your family life. So think about your own childhood. It's really possible that some of the first memories that flood into your mind are your family's traditions, right? Traditions build a sense of like continuity in family life. Like they link the past, the present, and the future. My boys know that every single time it rains hard, we take off our shirts and run around like wild, crazy idiots. Like that's just a family tradition that we all do every time. They know that and they depend on that. And the more little family traditions you have and the more fun you can incorporate into your life, it's just like a multiplier, force multiplier of attachment. Fun and tradition do so much for that. So, think about little things that you guys look forward to in your families. And if you don't have things, try and create some things and really bring that out. And then emphasize fun. As your kids get older, you find yourself talking more and more about serious, boring stuff with your kids. It's like, how is school? Why are you behind on your schoolwork? Tell me about, we've got to do these chores. Like, it's really not fun for kids to interact with us. And healthy relationships rely on a balance of positive and negative, right? And it's also a balance between fun and serious. And so, yeah, prioritizing fun, bringing more fun and joy. And it's not about, Disneyland or anything like that. It's just having, a spirit of positivity in your family. And then I've been referencing this quite a bit, but the last thing I want to bring up here is stress. So if we're looking at Epstein's list of things, you see stress management. That does not actually refer to teaching your kids coping skills. It actually refers to you as a parent managing your own stress. Because like I said, when we're stressed, we divest ourselves of relationships. I know when I go home after a hard day of work or something like that, I'm just a little less attuned to the family, right? I'm more, the term in psychology is called egocentric. It doesn't mean I think I'm more important than my kids, but I'm just stuck inside myself. I can't get outside of myself. And of course, that doesn't help family attachment at all. And learning how to manage your own stress as a parent increases your own bandwidth to just be present to your children and to listen to them and to hear them and to let go of control. The best thing that you can do as a parent isn't so much to control them as much as it is to just to be a sounding board for them, to listen to them, to respond to them. It's like back to the gardening versus the engineering principle. To have a really good garden involves letting go of control. It doesn't mean that you don't weed and you don't do things to make it better, but that is important. So now I think what I'd like to do is just open it up for some questions if there's any, and we can do that for a little bit.
Wow. I just wrote pages of comments and wisdom and insight, and the questions were just pouring in at one point, but I wanted to keep you going on your roll. So some of these will go back to topics and points that you addressed earlier, and some will be just brand new. So as I'm reading these out, and people who are still in the audience are welcome to keep typing in your questions as you see them. So, oh boy. Could you speak about the importance of developing friendships? How do we help our children navigate it with the right friends
So
without being controlling about their friends as they get older?
yep. Oh man, what a good question. I explicitly teach my children emotional intelligence, because that's not something that necessarily like magically unfolds as we get older. And so teaching our kids, uh, the principles of being a good friend, I think as parents, we know what a lot of those principles are. One thing that we could do a little bit more of as parents, though, is asking how the other peers in our kids' lives make them feel. So I've got a kid, he's not a teenager yet, but he's 12, and he is like this kid who we just switched schools, and he was the popular kid at the old school. Now he's not the popular kid, and he's going through this huge existential crisis, trying to be friends with all the cool kids at the school. And some of them are total jerks. Like they're awful children. And so I'm like, Joey, like, I know you want to hang out with this boy, but it sounds like he doesn't make you feel very good. Like, talk to me about how he makes you feel. And that sometimes, like, if you do that repeated enough, you kind of, kids will realize like, oh, this is not a kid I want to have around me, even if he's, technically the popular kid. And, it's like a fading thing, but parents should get to know the parents of their kids. And I think that goes even into high school, personal opinion. And I think most parents would want that, but they get anxious about it. My wife, my kid just made a new friend. He's a freshman and made this new friend. And my wife called up the mom and she was like, oh, thank goodness. I'm glad you called. I really wanted to call you, but my kid was saying it's embarrassing and nobody does that anymore. Like, just do it. I mean, get to know the parents. I mean, it's really, really important because for all the reasons that we know about. But friendship, I think, is really important, in like real friendship, and teaching our children what real friendship is and the responsibilities that come with it, and how it makes you feel. Yeah, really important.
Very good. Thank you. I remember my oldest daughter taught my middle daughter back when, the middle one was 6 or something. And she said, Sophia, remember, in our family, we don't just have a sleepover. We have to get to know the other family. And I just thought, oh, how funny is that? And that really kind of became a tradition of our family, is you got to know the whole family friend.
Mm-hmm.
So very cool. You touched on it about emotional intelligence, but Tatiana asked about what books would you recommend? If you were to have a handful of books on your nightstand or your bookshelf that would help you survive and thrive during these parenting years of teens, preteens, young adults, what would you recommend?
Great question. Okay. For teens specifically, one of my favorite books is called Brainstorm by Dan Siegel. He's a well-known neurologist, I believe. Excellent book. If you want to understand your kid, boy, it's super helpful. He also wrote a book that I like called Parenting from the Inside Out. That is really good, is attachment focused. Probably my favorite book about this stuff, it's not like a self-help book exactly, but it just talks about attachment in general. It's called Hold On to Your Kids. It talks about the importance of attachment and connection, but it doesn't read like a self-help psychology book, which is just kind of nice. It's by Gabor Mate. And then another book that I'd recommend, it's technically a religious book, but it is life-changing, I think. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And I recommend that because it's like kind of an antidote to what we as parents experience with just the chaos of life. It's figuring out how to cut chaos out of your life in a way that's workable.
Wow, those are definitely off the beaten path of parenting
Mhm.
books. So I appreciate a new perspective
Mhm.
and addressing different issues of attachment
Yeah.
and connection. All right, let's get back to the questions. If anybody has to leave, please look at the podcast later and just, move it along so that you can get to these question and answer period, which I think will offer a lot of very useful information. All right, in talking about the hierarchy of the family, what if you have a teenager who's not so keen on that concept and thinks that they have equal voice and footing as
Uh-huh.
you do?
Uh-huh.
Democracy.
Yeah, there's some teens that really take that further than others, and there's legitimacy to that. I will say that choosing to enter into that battle is probably, and win that battle is more worth it than letting your teen run the show. And, kids are like plants, and some plants need like lots and lots of water and attention, or some kids are like orchids and they're just like these delicate little things that are so much harder, and we don't always get to choose what we have. But the idea of being really grounded in your own authority as a parent is, there's actually, kids on the surface are seeking control. I think, teenagers and, kids are little power mongers, right? Like of course they want to be in control. But actually what is going on deep down inside is they're pushing boundaries, and there is a longing for them to find the boundary, actually, because boundaries bring safety. There's some kids, and especially a lot of really smart kids, who question authority. It's not about the idea of like, we never question authority. It's more like, how do we go about it? My kids don't agree with everything I say. I mean, heck no, right? Of course not. But at least as things stand, they respect my authority enough they challenge it all the time, but like, we can enter into a dialogue and talk about it. And sometimes that dialogue turns into an argument. But yeah, it's worth having. And it's different than, I'm not saying authoritarian, right? Authoritarian means like, I'm in control, I'm in charge. When rigidity meets rigidity in relationships, things do not go well anywhere in life. It doesn't work. But an authority, think about somebody who's like the best, I don't know, leader or authority. They're not necessarily like authoritarian in how they approach relationships. They give a lot of autonomy and freedom. That's more what I'm talking about. That's definitely more what the research talks about as an effective parenting style. I mean, of course you want to encourage, like, it sounds like if you have that teenager, there's also an element that's really cool about that, right? Like, you want somebody who's going to question authority and grow to become autonomous and all of that. That's good stuff. You want to nurture it, while at the same time maintaining your authority. And it's not going to be easy. Yeah, I wish there was like an easy answer I could give to that, but there's totally not.
Thank you. You mentioned that parents need to let go of their own feelings about what success is and let teens define that for themselves. My fear is that the short-sighted choices that my teen makes with their developing brain are going to limit what choices he has in the future to further his success. How do you find a balance for that?
Yeah, good. Really good question. Oh my gosh. So a portion of my talk that I was going to give, but I cut out for time, is the idea of making your family values more explicit. So kids, they sort of download our values as we get older. Most of the time, as in adolescence, they like throw them aside and like, I don't care about school, or I don't care about that, whatever, mom. A lot of times they typically come back to those values though, right? Like once they discover their identities, they can come back to them. Now, of course, we don't want them to cut off their nose just to spite their face and kind of, limit their future choices. And so I think an in-between route there is really, it's having lots of discussions about values. So one thing that I will do with families, you can actually find this online, is it's called a values card sort. So if you just Google values card sort, there's a million different ways you can use those different cards. Are online, they're free, to sort out what your own values are. And then you can talk about them with your kids and talk about that recipe for happiness that I was talking about with your kids, and talking about like what works and what doesn't work. I also think that healthy boundaries where a child is autonomous to an appropriate degree, but has the guardrails. If they're doing truly behavior that's dangerous, then you put limits on that, which can involve painful things like taking phones away or just, whatever. That kids can come back to that. And I'm honestly a really good example of that. I was I'm actually sort of rebellious by nature. I was kind of rebellious as a kid. I barely graduated high school, 6th from the bottom of my class, if I recall. And nobody thought that I had a future, like literally. And they had good reason to think that. And then I went to college and I figured myself out and I came back around. And you don't want to control your kids so much that it damages that relationship for the long haul. I think it's really important to maintain a healthy relationship with your kid, which might involve some patience. It is really hard, but patience, and then having the courage to do what it takes when it comes to it. There's just some decisions that our kids may not have the healthy mindset to make, and we can't let them make those decisions if we can help it. So yeah, again, these questions are so good, but they all require a whole book that probably hasn't even been written yet.
Well, you're helping me see, different topics and issues that we can invite you back for, or that we need to address in the coming year. Just for everybody to know, on March 1st, we have Kim Bevel coming to speak about happiness, the happiness hunt. And she uses a lot of research as well. So put March 1st on your calendar. We will see if that will be in person or virtual. There are still, are you good to
I got a few more minutes.
tackle a few more? All right, great. We have somebody who would like to know what's a good resource for emotional intelligence, maybe a book or I would think off the top of my head, Mark Brackett.
Yeah, there are, if you just look on Amazon, there's going to be a whole bunch of books on emotional intelligence. Yeah, I don't know that I've read any that are like dynamic, inspiring books, though. I'll be totally honest. I don't think I have a good reference for that one particularly. I think
If you think of something, you can email me, and when we send out our next
Great.
mail, we can add some of those resources. Jill would like to know about how kids are looking for an increase in dopamine, and those kids are often looking at gaming.
Yeah.
And what kind of limits do you recommend we give to our teens on that?
Yeah, we live in this total, especially right now, it's even more amplified with COVID world. So the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry says 2 hours a day of screen time is all we should get. And more than that, our brains are not healthy. And that is depressing. I get my weekly screen time report from Siri. It's like, you have become your screen. Like, it's so bad. It's so bad. And so I think there needs to be, more flexibility than we've ever had before with that. But the thing about gaming that's challenging is, the teen brain is seeking out stimulation, and there's what is more stimulating than a game, right? Like, it's low effort, high reward, these graphics, and there is an element of social connection in it. then I don't want to minimize it. I think that there's something legitimate to that, especially because in our world, like kids don't really hang out much after school anymore. It's more like, let's go home and hop on the games together. It's just a reality, for better or worse. But the impact that gaming has specifically on your kids' brains, we can't minimize it, and especially gaming. My kids like gaming just as much as anybody else, and they'll get done with games and like their faces will literally look messed up. Like there's something wrong with them. I'm like, Matthew, your face looks all googly eyed. Like, what is going on with your brain? And it's because they game too long, and so it is really hard because, entering this, you have to decide in your own parent conscience what the rules are going to be and how hard you're going to enforce them. I can tell you in our family, our kids get some screen time like during the week, like we'll watch movies or whatever. But gaming specifically, I'm pretty hardcore about. So they're allowed, we call it homework party. They're allowed to have games after homework on Wednesdays. And then a few hours over the weekend is how that goes. But it's very clear, like there's game time and then there's days where you can't have game time. And that is, parents, sometimes I'll bring that up and they're like, gosh, it's teenagers. Honestly, I have teenagers and it's still what we're doing. And because we've been doing it forever, it actually doesn't cause a whole lot of conflict. But where I think more flexibility is needed, unfortunately, is, to do homework and to socially connect with their peers. They need their devices. And then, so it's going to go more than the recommended 2 hours. That's just seems like a reality that we all have to kind of navigate and negotiate.
I remember one of our speakers spoke about the differentiating screen time.
Yep.
So looking at a documentary or doing research for your project is very different than gaming screen time or family movie
Right.
time, or so that might be a good idea to try and differentiate that screen
So
time
true.
for people. All right, next question. Do you have advice for a single mother with a teenage daughter where the mother is struggling between keeping her authority as a parent versus also developing a relationship of friendship with the child? Basically wanting to keep the parent-child relationship and keep open communication as we start dealing with adult situations, going to parties where alcohol and drugs are present. So
Yeah.
just that dichotomy
Tough
of
one.
friendship, parenting.
I would just emphasize what I was saying before about the idea of bringing other adults in when possible. So, a therapist can actually make a remarkable adult in your kid's life because they will help your child think through some of these things. So you don't always have to be the one to do this. It doesn't mean that the therapist is the one setting the limits, but it can take some of the pressure off. I lean in the direction of, in general, don't do things that are going to cost the relationship unless it's worth it. So if it's like, your kid's going to go to a party and will most certainly get drunk and get in trouble, that seems like a pretty worth it boundary to be pretty strong on. But then be as flexible as possible with things that matter less. We try and my wife and I will oftentimes talk about how it's frustrating that most of parenting involves saying no. And so we try and say, we have a principle in our house. It's like, unless there's a good reason to say no, we should try and say yes as a default, because our default is no. That doesn't mean we're overly permissive parents. I don't think our children would say that I'm an overly permissive parent, but we definitely try and say just yes as much as possible, so that the no's, when we give them, they really count. Again, in that situation where it's single mom, teenage girl, there's a lot going on. I mean, I think some messiness is going to be inevitable. I think having faith that you're going to get through it and that there's going to be a relationship on the other side is really important because teenagers, they're telling themselves like, oh, I don't care. When I move out, I'm never going to talk to my mom again. They don't want that though, and they don't actually believe it. They're more afraid of it. So yeah, that's what I would say. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm looking at my computer. It says it's at 1%. So I need to plug my computer in or I'm going to disappear.
Good, you do that. And while he's making sure he doesn't disappear for good, I'm going to add a comment by Suzanne who said, if your child is having behaviorals, consider getting some labs done, including a full thyroid, amino acid test, hormones, sleep test, mineral test. So, you know, teens are a complex human being, and so there can be other things going on as well.
True.
So, our son is super sweet, but can be annoying. Lots of noises, weird voices, odd responses, kind of a boy. We are feeling that behavior is secluding him. That behavior is secluding him from his peers more so now that he's in middle school. How can we help him without crushing his spirit?
Yeah, well, in our practice, we have a socialization group for kids. And what the whole idea of is it teaches kids to have self-awareness and self-control. That's what good relationships actually are consistent of. And it starts with self-awareness. So, you know, boys are boys and boys sometimes are total idiots. They just are. And so my go-to line in my household is when my kid's acting annoying, I'll be like, hey, Justin, what are you doing right now that nobody else is doing? Look around you. Or, hey, Justin, how do you think that behavior is making people feel? Look at your brother's facial expression. Do you think he likes it when you're making that noise or singing that song or playing that annoying thing on the piano? No. And so I think, yeah, this in your parenting, just focusing on developing that self-awareness. It is slower to develop in boys, obviously. I didn't develop self-awareness for a really, really long time. I was probably in college before I got that down. And so it has to be just taught. And it's weird, you know, I've read a million parenting books. It's not that idea is not something that's taught very often. Or talked about in these books is teaching self-awareness. And it just comes through asking questions so that the kid can become aware of it. And it is painful and it is going to have a little bit of an impact on their self-esteem. I would say that that's better than them going and going and going and then just kind of it falling into place one day like, oh my gosh, I have no friends. And you know, that's probably doing it gradually and lovingly, because nobody's going to be more flexible and accepting than parents are most of the time. And so if it drives you guys as parents crazy, it's almost certainly having an impact on you know, with peers and stuff.
Thank you. I remember having a conversation with somebody in the development field about trying to be or reflect back their prefrontal cortex. So, you know, they're developing their prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of their brain. They're developing emotional intelligence. And so our role as a parent during these development years is to kind of be that external part to
Exactly.
help them, mold them, kind of get them one more rung up the ladder.
I love that. But yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Another question about boys. I'm curious, being a mom of two boys, ages 16 and 13, sometimes I feel a bit outnumbered in terms of what boys find as fun versus what I do as a mom and a female. I even consider myself a tomboy and throw footballs with them. How does your wife handle being the only female in such a boy intense household? Maybe we should have her speak next time.
Seriously. You know, we even recently got a dog and the dang dog is a boy too. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's crazy. It's definitely crazy. I grew up with a brother and of course we would try and like outdo each other with inappropriate comments all the time. And when you multiply that and you have like 5 and no girls, it's insane. I mean, it's just, it's crazy. the conversations that they'll have. I would say this, that, my wife, there's an element of her that's like also girly. She doesn't feel like being the mom who like goes and throws in footballs. She's more like she can handle their wackadoo sense of humor and that sort of thing. I just think it's important to, a saying I heard one time that I love is the idea of becoming temporarily indispensable in your child's life. And to do that, you have to meet your child where they're at, right? My kid, I love gardening. My kids, 4 of them, could care less about gardening. I will never get them to have interest in this. It's just not ever going to be a thing. So I might make them help me with garden chores, but I'm never going to like try and connect with them over gardening. And so instead, I have to go meet them where they're at, which a lot of times involves me watching shows that are so stupid, in my opinion. Or, one of my kids is into Pokemon cards. I could care less about playing Pokemon, but just kind of entering into it on his level. The thing that I think is like encouraging though, is I don't think it takes as much as sometimes we think. So little kids, if you label something as quality time, you say like, we're going to have quality time now, we're going to spend our time. It can be pretty short and it kind of fills their bucket. Just little shots of it. So I played Pokemon with Justin over the weekend, and he's been talking about it every single day. Like, thanks for playing Pokemon. It was 5 minutes, but he thought it was quality time. So just meeting your kid where you're at, it doesn't mean pretending to be something that you're not. I don't think that's what's needed either.
I remember back when I was in the throes of 3 young children within 4 years, I think it was Jim Fay and Foster Cline,
Yeah.
that if you invest 5 minutes, ideally at the beginning of your day for each child. So for me, that was, 15 minutes.
Yep.
That would make the number of issues and distress later in the day just diminish greatly. And whenever I could do that, I would kick myself and say, oh, I need to remember to do this tomorrow and the next day, because it really made a difference. Yeah, thanks for that reminder of the Pokemon cards. All righty, how to help cope with teen kids in picking and being very picky about choosing their friends. For instance, my kid doesn't like video games. He'd rather play chess, but his peers talk about video games and basketball. I try to help pair him with like-minded peers, but you don't always find the good fit. So, any advice?
Oof. What do I think about that? Yeah, I think we want to pair, we want our kid, the best thing to happen is when our kids can find like-minded souls, right? That's amazing. It doesn't always happen. I certainly didn't have that in my high school experience at all. And so I think there does need to be a little bit of flexibility sometimes. Like I really literally wasn't as interested in the same things that my friends were when I was in high school, and I just kind of needed to learn eventually to accept that. The hard thing is, I don't think anyone could have made me accept that. Like that had to be a choice I made. My parents would bring that up with me sometimes, and you can bring that up with your kid, but your kid has to be the one to decide to give the benefit of the doubt and to try things out and to experiment. A lot of times though, what's underneath the surface of that kind of attitude also is some insecurity. And so kids are nervous about reaching out and expanding their social network because it's a risk and it's hard and could lead to rejection. And so it's easier to just reject the kids outright rather than take the risk of getting rejected yourself. That might be a thing worthwhile to explore, to see if any of that's going on, and asking about it. And if that is the case, then it sort of changes the narrative of how you talk about these things. Sometimes kids literally just don't know how to do small talk. And so talking about things that they don't know about with their peers is really hard. And that's a skill that you can build and work on and that sort of thing.
Thank you. One last question. How would you recommend pushing kids to keep attending their sports practices or music practices or whatever it is regularly? You know, this topic brings up fights with kids on a daily basis, even though they enjoy the sports that they are doing. I think of
Yeah.
short-term pain for long-term gain. That's what I think of.
Yeah. This is one of those things that's really leads to tons of frustration in parenting, and it's like so hard because I'm telling you guys all about positive interactions and get that positive to negative ratio shaped up, and then you have this, and you can't not let your kid do things that they committed to, right? That's just not a reality most of the time. I would say a few things. One is if you are going to have it be an expectation that your child goes, it needs to be a rule, and there needs to be no arguing about the rule. It's just the rule. And eventually kids would learn that it's the rule. They might disagree with it and they might fight about it, but the fighting would probably be a little bit less. But as parents, you would need to be 100% consistent in enforcing the rule. I think that helps a little bit. And then on the flip side, there are times when kids get involved with an activity and it's not a good fit. So I had my oldest a few years ago try martial arts, and he hated it. It was awful. We made him do it for probably way longer than was good for him, because I was like, he's got to learn it. It's discipline and it's positive. And look, these teachers are amazing. And it just wasn't his thing. And I had to realize, oh, wait, it's my thing. I need to let go of this. It's different. What the question is though, right? Like, my kid likes the activity, is successful in the activity, but just is sort of lazy, I guess, about the discipline. Part of our role as parents is we are their externalized executive functioning. Executive functioning is the boss of your brain, and self-discipline, self-awareness, self-control, that kind of thing. And that doesn't finish developing till you're 25 years old. And so an unfortunate part of parenting is we have to be our kids' executive functioning sometimes. We have to be the boss of their brain, not the boss of them, not the boss of their lives. But, delay of gratification is just not something that kids' brains are wired to do very well. And so we unfortunately have to enforce it sometimes. And even if that comes with arguing, I think there's just an element of that, like that as parents, like that's sort of what we signed up for. It's not going to be happy all the time. But we do have to pick our battles, right? And so if it's practice that you're going to enforce, maybe think about other areas that you can make more fun and more flexible when possible.
Whew. We did it. 11 o'clock. We covered so many topics, and it just uncovered even more topics that we have to discover. So amazing. Thank you so much, Jim, for your patience, your expertise, your humility, your ability to bring in your stories of real life to help us relate better. So we can post this podcast in the next 48 hours. So anyone can look at it. You can find the resources that he mentioned. And if you have any more feedback about topics that came up with this, feel free to email us at pinccsd@gmail.com for topics that you want to continue exploring together, or topics that you want Jim Langley to come back and explore with us, with his help. So thank you all. Remember to look for your emails, sign up for the emails. From March 1st, we'll be with Kim Bevel on happiness, and April 5th will be a tougher topic of drugs, vaping, and other substances. So with that, we'll sign off. Stay warm during this next snow, and we'll see you soon. Thank you all. Bye-bye.